Hello. This is the last of the three lectures, and this is going to focus on the regulatory landscape and the auditing practices in data security. We'll talk about the HIPAA security rules categories. We'll talk about administrative, physical, and technical safeguards and other organizational requirements. We'll also get into the high-tech Act. We'll talk a little bit more about forensic practices, audit triggers, and more. Okay, here is something that we'll see a lot of. You'll hear these terms administrative, physical, technical safeguards, organizational requirements, and then policies and procedures. Let's take a look at them one by one. Administrative safeguards are basically the policies and procedures to manage all the security for EPHI. This includes training and contingency training. So, all of your security training, risk analysis, workforce clearance procedures, all of that are fall under administrative safeguards. Physical safeguards are the measures that we protect systems, meaning the equipment, the data, the software from physical threats and any unauthorized access. These are such things as locked server rooms, workstation security, device, and media controls. Technical safeguards are all the technology and policies to protect ePHI and control access. This means access control, transmission security. So, one that was a big deal right after HIPAA was passed was the unique user IDs. We could no longer have group logons that said medical resident A or what have you. Everybody had to have a unique user ID and password. Some of the other technical safeguards, in addition to unique user IDs, are the encryption and the audit logs. Of course, all of this doesn't make any sense or do any good unless we have the fourth bullet point, the organizational requirements. So these are the contracts or arrangements, for example, the business associate agreements that ensure appropriate safeguards for EPHI between entities. So this could be, say, you get new EHR software installed. I mean, you need to have a signed agreement that's bringing in the vendor as a business associate that says if they see any EPHI in the course of their duties, they will protect it and so on. And then finally, all these things need to be documented per CMS. So we need to have written policies and procedures for HIPAA compliance with documentation retained for at least 6 years and regularly updated. A lot of times this takes the form of a policy manual, and you have to have documentation of any updates and reviews. And again, we talked about the administrative safeguards, all your security management processes, assigned security responsibility, workforce security, evaluations, business associates. The physical safeguards, we always think of the server rooms, but we also have workstation use, right? One hospital I'm familiar with in California had little access cards for the physicians, so it would log them in whenever they walked by a workstation, right? They need to have policies and procedures on that. The device and media controls, and then the technical safeguards, right? So these consist of both technology and policies. These are your unique user IDs, the encryption, audit logs, audit controls, maybe dual authentication, right? To make sure that that person who's logging into your system really is who they say they are. And then organization-wide, we talked a little bit about business associates. Believe it or not, we don't think very much about them. But if you think about it, many times in a hospital setting, especially, we have a number of people that are exposed to PHI who aren't really our employees. We have technicians who work on biomedical equipment, people that work on our IT infrastructure. All these people may, in fact, be exposed to ePHI. We also have the group health plan requirements, right? So payers are sending information back and forth between the point of service where the health plan member gets their care and information is going back. So we need to have ways of protecting it going in both directions. We talked about policies and procedures, documentation. Again, this documentation needs to be retained for at least 6 years and updated with dates noted. And now we get into some fun stuff. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, and the high-tech changes. So basically, this puts some new teeth into what we do with business associates. And it basically says business associates must comply with most of the same rules as a covered entity. Just because you're a business associate, an organization like Kaiser, like UC San Francisco, and others can't just say, well, that was the contractor's fault. The contractor and the covered entity are responsible. And then there are breach notification requirements for breaches of any unsecured ePHI. ePHI that hasn't been made unusable, unreadable, or indecipherable is considered a breach. And encryption secures this. And hopefully, all these endpoint devices like smartphones, tablets, laptops, MacBooks, all of these things, you have these things in place to protect PHI that's at rest, in motion, in use, and disposed. A lot of people just think if they format a hard drive, that's enough. You actually need to do more to make sure that any ePHI that's on that device is not readable and it's totally indecipherable. And forensics. These are designated individuals who review access laws at specific times and do audit trails based on trigger events. This could be a patient requesting disclosure accounting. This could be looking at failed logins. All these things would fall under that. And there are other ways that we can have monitoring. We can have the last name of an employee that matches an access record. Sometimes that will trigger audits. And then we can have the VIP records, right? These are records of celebrities, athletes, politicians who may be seen at your facility. Anybody who accesses that could start an audit trail. Records with little or no activity for 120 days, employee records, all these other different types of things, right? Spousal records, all these things are potential audit trigger events. And again, employee complaints, employee terminations, patient complaints, employee mistakes, insider wrongdoing, security incidents, all of these can trigger audits. And the last slide. Oh, that is the last slide. And that's all I have for you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online. Bye now.